It's a deal, right? Ride with me if you ride with me. You can slide with me if you feel like 550 on the 5 sticky. Come get high with me. That's a deal, right? That's a deal, right?
So they want me down and out. Hey, we ain't going out like that. We ain't going out like that. Watch me go and bounce right back. Down for the count, but that hound strike.
Welcome back to another episode of Whole Brother Live. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to say at the offset, I will not be before you long today. You may ask why. So, my birthday was June 17th. Today is June 20th. And I'm still kind of back and forth with different, activities. Some people might look at it as a birthday month, but I got a lot of different things going on. But wanted to make sure to do this episode for a variety of reasons. One, it's timely with my birthday because this episode will be an interview I actually did with someone else about my origin story. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of understand some background on me as you listen to these podcast episodes because, I tend to, some might say, be formal, speaking on specific topics. I feel confident in discussing. But I do think understanding people's why or their history helps you appreciate and understand the work that they do better. So this is some personal insight on me. Questions some of you have asked personally will get answered in this interview. So it's more about my background, my life, my family, my history, more so than black men's mental health conversations per se from a doctor perspective, but more so from a childhood on up to adulthood perspective is what that podcast will be about. I also want to mention it's June, which is Men's Health Month. We are in the middle of a fundraiser as the Whole Brother Mission. We are trying to raise $30,000 by the end of the month, June 30th. We are currently sitting at $16,050. If we reach our goal of $30,000 by the end of the month, it will be matched by a private donor for a total of $60,000. So we get to 30 by June 30th. That $30,000 is matched, $60,000 toward Black men's mental health. You and your personal donation and sharing have been a blessing to men all across the country. So I ask you, I know some people aren't able to donate. The donations are tax deductible, but if you cannot donate, please just share it. You can find the link to the GoFundMe at atwbm.com. That's atwbm.com. It's also right there on our website, wholebrothermission.com. So we have about 10 days to raise an additional $14,000, and I believe we can do it with some of the momentum that we have this year. So please pass on the fundraiser if you support this work. If you like me, if you appreciate a podcast, contributions like these are the lifeblood of a nonprofit. So to see it continue, we have to support this work. So please consider donating, and definitely if you are not able to donate, please just share it. atwbm.com takes you to a button where you can click to go to the GoFundMe page and then share it far and wide. Now, here's the episode for today. You learning a little bit more about me.
Dr. Maliek Blade.
Hello.
Where are you from?
Washington, D.C., Southeast to be specific.
That's the interesting thing about D.C. I've had the opportunity to live there for 4 years. It's one of the few places where people are very specific. In fact, sometimes they will even tell you what hospital they were born in.
Absolutely.
Oh, you know?
Yes.
Okay, what's the hospital?
Something Hospital for Women. It changed the name of it.
Okay.
It was that name when it was
Gotcha.
in 93. But I don't think it's called that anymore.
Okay.
My mom's going to be upset that I don't remember the exact name.
But it's somewhere in Southeast DC.
Mm-hmm. Something Hospital for Women.
Right.
That's what it was called back in 93.
Got it. And why do you think that matters so much in DC?
Oh, gosh. Well, there's cultural differences. So like the preeminent divide there is DC and Maryland, that culture,
right?
And then Baltimore, which is a city in Maryland. sometimes when I'm traveling, some people might mistakenly say that I'm from Baltimore, and I get very much so up in arms about that because you can't do that.
Right.
So Baltimore is its own culture, and then you have D.C., Maryland, Virginia, the DMV.
Right.
Certain parts of Maryland and Virginia, though, not all of Virginia, not all of Maryland.
Right.
But all of D.C. is pretty much included.
Gotcha.
And that is its own culture. And then there's this thing about street cred, I think, that exists too. So it's like sometimes people will push back on, were you really born in D.C. though?
Yes.
Or were you born in PG County, Maryland? Because if you were born in D.C., then you get more street cred. But if you're in PG County, Maryland, then you might be suburban. So there's that whole divide of how much street cred do you have? To be clear, though, I was born in Southeast Washington, D.C. Not a threat, but just letting you know.
Gotcha. yeah. Just to clear it all up. So what was the family situation like growing up?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, my grandmother had a 2-bedroom apartment in Southeast Washington, D.C., the Circle, Simple City, Chocolate City. And she had 4 children, my mom, my aunt, my 2 uncles, so 4 children. My mom had 2 sons, me and my brother. My aunt had a daughter and a son. My first uncle had 1 daughter, and then my second uncle had a daughter and a son. And for an extended period of time, we all lived in that 2-bedroom apartment.
Wow.
And slowly, over time, people were able to break off into their own thing. So when my mom moved out, we moved from D.C. to Maryland, Suitland, Maryland. And so it started off, all of us kind of bunched in there together. And then it was my mother and my brother in Suitland, Maryland. My brother went to college, so it was just my mother and I. But then my mother remarried around 3rd, 4th grade. We moved to a different part of Maryland and spent most of my time there. And then by the time college came, which was 2011, I left Maryland to go to the South, which was a big culture shock.
Okay, so let's rewind, because what were the circumstances that prompted so many of your family members to be living in the same house?
Yeah, so it was a complex family dynamic. So my grandmother had 4 different children with 4 different men. Those men weren't really present in their children's lives. And then she also was an alcoholic. So my grandmother, while she did have a home, she wasn't necessarily in place to be that protective force one would assume would be the case with a mother. So my mom and her siblings did lack in that regard. And I think that contributed quite a bit toward how they parented their children.
What was that like for you? I mean, growing up with such a dynamic family situation.
Yeah, I do think my mom being protective shielded me from a lot. So even though my family has some diverse experiences and there's some things that other siblings, cousins participated in that she wouldn't want me to do, I was near it, but she kind of was able, especially when she moved out, to kind of keep me away from it. So amongst those 3 other siblings, she's seen as the church lady. So my mom kind of kept me in church, raised on gospel music, and, got heavily involved with, some call it liturgical dance, but it was called pantomime in church. So I was kind of like immersed in church because I think she thought that was a saving grace for her. And she thought, let me pass it on to my son. But at the same time, I think I have a unique balance where, and I think she'll appreciate this, my mom was the nice church lady. My aunt was not the nice church lady. I'll just say that. But the benefits of that is I think I've been equipped to navigate a variety of spaces because I have the church lady mom. I'll tell you more about this, but I have the pastor older brother. But then I also had the aunt who, knew how to navigate through protecting yourself in the more defensive posture. So, like, I would say I have the unique balance from my aunt, my mom, and my brother of street smarts, church, and then, of course, salvation kind of fine tuned all of that.
Yeah, that's definitely something I look forward to getting more into. So, like, when I think about Southeast DC, it's kind of known in a lot of ways for being a tough neighborhood and spaces. Like, was that something that you grew up being aware of, and how did you feel like you navigated that space?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I was around a lot of it and saw it. It was in my family. But then when my mom remarried, we then had the privilege of being able to have me go to private school. And the interesting thing I saw is, okay, now I'm at private school with these suburban kids that have pools in their backyard, and they want to act like they're from Southeast DC. And that was like, what is this? Y'all want to go? But I, from what I saw, wanted to distance myself as much as possible. So I didn't want to follow some of that trajectory.
That's ironic. So the guy that was actually from that hood was like, look, I'm all about moving.
Getting away.
And then those who... But it kind of goes back to that situation of street cred that you said about, the neighborhoods and why, so there's, okay,
They were from Upper Marlboro, Maryland.
Yes.
But they wanted to portray like they were from Southeast DC.
Got it. And so what was that transition like of, moving into Suitland, being now with, having a stepfather?
Yeah. So I want to say, I think it was a smooth transition. And even looking back on it now, I think he was very careful. He knew that he was stepping into an already existing family dynamic. He didn't have any children of his own. And what I respect is I know a lot of people whose parents remarry, there's a step parent, and then that step parent, particularly the stepfather, might be overbearing.
Yeah.
He was anything but. He was open if I wanted to include him in something, but he didn't want to try to overbear. So it's like, that's between you and your mom. And he slowly over time worked his way into our dynamic. And I respect that. But there also was this unique dynamic, I would say, of I always think that my dynamic with my mom and brother is unique when I compare it to other friends' family dynamics. So the other guys I met at school, the suburban kids, they didn't talk to their parents about anything. I talked to my mom about everything. Even as time went on, my brother and I had conversations about, hey, you remarried now, and that's your husband. And we actually talked to her about honoring him in that way, even though we were the apple of her eye. That's your husband. So what does it look like to truly honor him as your husband and not put your sons before your husband? That's something that we talked about.
Okay, I just got to say, that is a deep thing for the sons to bring that up to a mother. I mean, that does show a level of intimacy and even just awareness. That's interesting. So lastly, I mean, got to ask about, the dynamic with your older brother, and what was that like for you two? What was that like for you two together to move into this new family dynamic?
So my mom had my older brother when she was 16, and she had me when she was 30. Wow. So we have a wide age gap. So for those early parts of my life, he functioned as more of a father. Yeah. And then I would say in more recent years, we've pivoted to more of that brother dynamic. Okay. So he was a big part of like my spiritual formation. I wouldn't have gone to college if he didn't have a church in North Carolina that had a relationship with a local seminary and college. I was in DC, Maryland, and I was considering going to Howard, but I really didn't want to go to college, but I was just doing it because I felt like I was supposed to. So I haphazardly, halfway did the application. And then Howard hit me up and was like, hey, we noticed you started the application but didn't finish it. It's a no. So they told me no because I didn't complete the application. And I was like, I'm going to try to go there anyway. But then my brother tells me, hey, there's this Christian college, majority white school. They're looking to diversify. If you're interested, you can go there tuition free.
I guess he didn't underscore the lack of diversity the way I would have liked. So I showed up there thinking, oh, they're Christians, you know, and it's got to be some black people there. There were not. So it was a unique cultural dynamic to move from Maryland to the South.
From chocolate city to being a chocolate chip.
Right, exactly. The one chocolate chip on the sugar cookie. So, you know, it was interesting. But he played a huge part in that. And I think that set the trajectory for a lot of my professional life. So even though he was just looking out like, hey, he knew what he went through to pay for college because we just had a single mom. He saw an opportunity, referred me to that, and now here we are, 3 degrees from that school.
Wow. That is something. And when did, you know, you mentioned your mom was known as kind of the church lady in the family, and that she definitely introduced, you know, those rhythms to you and your brother. But when would you say that faith became personal?
Yeah. So I never forget. It was 2007, right before I started high school. At that point in time, I had been active in church, and social media was getting popular at the time. It was MySpace. And there was a period of time where I was kind of having this double life where I was the church lady's son, and I was playing that part from my mom and my brother and the people at church. But then when social media, when this MySpace thing came about, you were able to have all these connections with all these people from all over. So unfortunately, even as a child, I was connecting with women on the internet who were adults in some instances, and kind of began exploring what that looked like, because as the church kid, it felt safe to maybe dip your toe in the water, have some conversations, send this, send that, rather than actually doing things in person in my immediate life. So it felt like there was some safety in making these connections on the internet. So that MySpace wave actually, I think, deterred my life for a little bit. So I was having those conversations, connecting with these people, and I remember we were visiting my brother in North Carolina, and I left my phone sitting somewhere. So then my mom sees a phone call to her teenager's phone from some out-of-state number. So it's like, well, who's calling you? I answered the phone, and then pretty much I'll just say that was the exposure of the double life. And that, I remember that turned into a prayer, like, okay, I realized, oh, so I'm not in control of my own life. So even if I was deceiving my mom and my brother and I was keeping it going, there's this higher power that's in control that can push a button at any time and exposed.
Wow.
So for me, it was a very quick, that from that day forward, everything changed. It was like, oh, you're not in control. So I know people describe their faith different ways, but for me, it's a lack of control. And I've grown to have some comfort in that, knowing that I'm not in control of my own life, because when I thought I was going down the wrong path. So I think for me, the major moment, that was the shift when it became personal, because I recognized that I couldn't just play the part to appease those that were looking, but I actually had to, in my private time, do the things that God would have me to. Wow.
That's powerful. And it just reminds me of the various places we see in scripture about the sovereignty of God, and that alone is He who made us and not us ourselves.
Right.
You know, He's the potter and we are the clay. And there's something, a deep truth that for some that can feel anxiety driving, right?
Right.
And for others, it can feel at peace. I'm curious about, what was it about the aspect of not being in control that caused you to that was actually a source of comfort?
But it's like, hey, I'm a human. I'm a created being. God is in control. I need to be on His side. So it's just like, why would I if I can't control the outcomes, if He's more powerful than me, I need to go get with that guy.
Yeah.
And that was how I thought that time at 14 years old. It was like, oh, so you gotta get with Him.
Yeah. So I'm also noticing around the same time, you mentioned moving to Suitland around 13. This is now 14. Like, there feels like a potential source of tension between this clarity of faith and direction that you want to have in your environment, which folks want to be more not about that. They want to be more like what they see as kind of maybe a more edgy dangerous way of being, like your peers. Was that a difficult thing to be, in your formative years, trying to live in a distinct way?
So there's this thing where like, well, if I can do this with her and connect with her, then I can also take it back to them and they'll be impressed with me. They'll respect me. So I do think there was also an identity issue where it was like I was doing certain things to be accepted and to be affirmed amongst my peers. And I think that was the core issue. Like, hey, whether they accept or reject you, that's a secondary or tertiary issue if you know who you are independently. So that's why I would say from that point forward, a lot of my attention has been toward, hey, we need to, if at all possible, establish a firm sense of identity at home so that boys, children in general, aren't stepping out into the world trying to get that validation from their peers who don't have a clue anyway.
And do you feel like you had that?
Yes, I had that, but I still wanted more. I remember articulating, having a conversation about, well, why isn't the love from your mother and your brother, why isn't that enough? And I remember as a teenager articulating, well, y'all are my family though. So you're it's different.
Right.
It's more valuable. It matters more if someone who's not my family choosing me. That matters more than my mother, my brother. Right. So I was longing for this validation from someone who was not born into my family, but met me along the way and chose me.
Got it. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. But it also sounds like, in spite of those yearnings for someone else, that when that started to take you further adrift away from who you really were, that there was some type of base that was like, that's a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you get accepted to this college, which you kind of go because it's an expectation, but also you got this great opportunity, through your brother's connection. And then you get there, and the first thing you experience is culture shock. Do you remember one of the most vivid moments where you were like, I am not in Suitland, Maryland anymore, or the DMV?
There's two that stand out. One, there were some issues related to racism, racist statements, and microaggressions that were happening in the dorm. And I remember there was an office for student life, and I raised some of the issues to the staff. The director of student life followed up with me, and I just thought it was strange that his first response when he met with me to discuss these issues was, Maliek, don't use this stuff as a crutch. And I thought, oh,
wow.
That's the first thing he said. And that's pretty much all he said. Just don't use this as a crutch. So that has always stuck with me. And then the other one I would say is my dorm mates. There were several situations, but one of them was my roommate. He got comfortable enough with me to share some of his shortcomings as it relates to race. He told me he was pleasantly surprised by me because the Black guys from the part of North Carolina he was from, he typically saw them in abusive relationships. They had white girlfriends and they were rude or abusive to them. So his view of Black men was the Black men from the part of North Carolina that he was from. So he candidly told me, he said when he found out I was his roommate, he was like, oh gosh, it would be me to get the Black guy.
Wow.
He said that. And then the conversation shifted toward, hey, I really like who you are as a person, and I think I have the best roommate. But now that I've gotten to know you, I feel like I have to be honest with you about my background. And he was honest that the N-word did fly around in his home life. So I think I'm a uniquely secure person that was able to live and have those conversations, though, because a lot of people wouldn't be able to. So we had those conversations, but I never forget the bridge too far was we were in a group setting. Well, one of the issues with him was when the Trayvon Martin happened. George Zimmerman was at trial, and he was basically, we were in at a Sheetz gas station, and the trial was happening, and he made a statement about Trayvon deserved it. That was one. And then the other one was he said that his uncles actually liked black women. He told a joke with a lot of peers around, and he said, my uncle always used to say black women are like prostitutes. Everybody wants one, but you don't want everybody else to know you've been with one. He said that was a joke that his uncles and so on would make. So, it was a lot of things like that where I just had to sit with it and like, okay, there's a lot wrong here. And the leadership at the school wasn't prepared to deal with it. So to condense the story, there were a lot of situations like that, which led to me saying, okay, let's address this. So as a sophomore, I put together a panel discussion at the school about race. And I got the president of the school involved, a local mega church pastor, and my brother was there, the only black pastor that I knew at the time. So I put together a panel discussion with the president, Danny Aiken, Pastor J.D. Greer of the Summit Church, and my brother, Pastor Jerome Gay. And we had the first of its kind, a discussion about race at this Southern Baptist school. Had over 300 in attendance, and many were blown away that it wasn't a school-hosted event. It was put together by one student.
Wow. Okay, there was a lot to unpack from what you just shared. I'll start with just shock of the things you experienced from your roommate itself. And you have a certain poise about you, and just how you carry yourself. But what do you remember? Because you kind of talked about these escalating, and it was weird because on the one end, there's this kind of, I guess, story of greater trust and self-disclosure that's happening. But then on the other end, there's also this like self-disclosure that's revealing some deep problems. So like, how did you think about that at the time? And how did you process that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because as I look back on it, I didn't feel worried. Looking back, I didn't feel worried. I just was like, wow, he's really messed up.
Right.
Even with being the minority there, I observed things and I just remember thinking, wow, they're tripping. But it didn't. I wasn't moved.
Right.
And I just said, let me try to help.
Where do you think that not being moved came from?
DC. Southeast DC.
So there it is.
It goes back to Southeast DC.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen so much. So it's like, this is lightweight. This is just people talking, just ignorance. But also I would say, I don't like pitting people's faith, cultural expressions of faith against each other. But I do feel like, and this might feel like we're going on a side trail, but I think my background, I came up in more charismatic Black church backgrounds. Was in a more Pentecostal church and then a more non-denominational church, and traveled to all the different variations of Black churches, whether it was preaching or miming as a teenager. So I do think what comes with that, I found, is an understanding of faith that leans very heavily on your personal experience with God. What I noticed when I got to seminary is when they would articulate faith, it wasn't very much so personal, but it was more so intellectual. Right. And I do think, not to say that one is right or wrong, but I do think that more experiential expression is one that is very firm. And I think that is what put me in a level of security when I was dumped into an environment of people that are very heady. And it's not to say that I'm anti-intellectual, but I do think when it comes to faith, Christian faith, on a very basic level, it is faith is the substance of things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. So I do think there are a lot of people that are familiar with church culture or certain theologies or doctrine, but I don't think have that personal experience of salvation, even at seminary. So I think I quickly realized, okay, these are a lot of people that just like church culture, but aren't saved. That's what I felt was going on. So that also felt like a level of security because I said, well, I'm resting in God. I know what's right. And hopefully they're able to snap out of some of this conservative branded Christianity that wasn't actually including salvation.
That's such a interesting insight, because I was actually going to ask you about this weird paradox that one would think you go from, what people would conceive of as more difficult circumstances, Southeast DC, DMV situation, to where even your pursuit in righteousness, your pursuit in other things would look down upon. Then you go to what some could see as a promised land of sorts, a Christian university context. But it is in this context that you are exposed to a type of racism that you had never experienced before. That could be hard to reconcile, but it sounds like what made sense to you is the recognition that, like they said, it's everybody that's going to church doesn't have the church in them, right? So there was a sense that you were able to make a distinguishing categorization to realize that some of the things that I'm hearing, you were never struggling with, is this a part of the authentic Christian faith?
Right. And I think I've had to articulate that because I've dealt with a lot of other Black people that passed through that setting and left confused.
Yes.
Because it's like, oh my gosh, what do I even believe about God now?
Right.
But I think that is because they came to faith in that context. So they tied their faith experience with the cultural expression. Whereas for me, the culture rejected me, but I didn't need that culture that wasn't associated with my salvation because I wasn't there at the time. So I do think the context of faith or community of faith culturally that we're in does play a part in how we perceive it. So sometimes we think that to draw near to God also means being accepted by that culture,
right?
Even though those two things are separate. Okay,
and again, we just to finish the loop on this sidebar that we're on, because I think what you just shared could be very helpful for folks who have, and we're talking about in a racial context, but it could be other, or it could be a gender issue, it could be something else. What is a word that you would have for someone who is struggling with their faith because of the marginalization that they felt in these sacred spaces that they didn't encounter as sacred in that way?
Yeah, it's just we need this ability to not allow our experiences with people that say they're representing God to frame how we see God.
Got it.
So like, God never rejected me at the seminary. It was people that were claiming to represent God that did, or that were struggling through their own racism or microaggressions. So sometimes it's hard to separate those things. If someone offended you in a church, you lump your offense in with not just the people of God, but God himself. So I do think on a very basic level is being able to understand that people who say they're representing God, or cultures that are saying to be Christocentric, things can still go wrong there. And that's not an indictment on God, but that's further evidence of the brokenness of people.
Got it. So, all right. gotta end up. So you organize this major symposium, this gathering to talk about race as a student. How did it go?
I think it went really good. It was well attended, got a lot of attention on it. Definitely made some folks uncomfortable because it was the first of its kind. And to even point to the success of it, that was the beginning stages of what then turned into an office of Kingdom Diversity, which they went and hired a professor, and then he shortly afterwards hired me as a coordinator in that office.
Wow.
So I ended up working for the president for a diversity office a year or so after that event.
Wow.
Which was the beginning of my professional career as a college student, trying to figure out, what's going to be my job or my career. It all started there at that school. So now I stand here today, kind of 10 years under my belt as a diversity consultant and professional.
Amazing. And all from that event that kind of got sparked out of turning what was ignorance into education, into progress. So when did the interest in counseling and mental health emerge?
Yeah. So that's the perfect segue, because the work that was being done at that school, Southeastern, word was spreading around the country in terms of that circuit of schools about the work that we were doing. So there was a school called Oklahoma Baptist University that reached out to our school and asked if I could apply for their new Dean of Diversity opening. So career-wise, in terms of higher ed, going from a coordinator to an assistant dean is progressing well. It's a big jump, actually. Interviewed for that and got offered that role. So then, even though I didn't want to go to Oklahoma, it was a good career move in terms of title. So I went to Oklahoma Baptist University as the Assistant Dean of Students for Diversity and Multicultural Student Services. Long title. And it was there, I reported to the Dean of Students. He suddenly had to resign for some reason. So in the college setting, the dean is typically responsible for discipline, a non-academic dean. So when he resigned, the responsibility for discipline and restoration and stuff like that fell to me. So I began having to work through a discipline or restoration process for students that got in trouble. And a lot of them ended up being Black male athletes who, like me in college, were the minority at a predominantly white school. So that school had diversity because they did have an athletics program. So they had Black football players, basketball players, and track and field and stuff. And I remember one guy in particular, he did something, he was harassing someone, he was blowing up, and we got caught it all on camera, and they were like, you gotta deal with this. And I'm like, okay. So I have him sitting in my office, and I'm like, what's going on? And I realize he's really defensive. He doesn't want to talk. He's just, it's almost like, I'm sure, imagine a nervous guy who was being interrogated by the police, but doesn't want to say too much. It was like that. So I know that he potentially could get expelled for this, but I'm like, I need you to talk to at least have some leverage here. So they were about to just say, you know what, if he won't talk, let's kick him out. And I used my little bit of power that I had, and I said, hey, let's give it a week and let me talk to him again. So they didn't expel him, and I talked to him again. And then I got him to talk more about what's going on in his personal life. And he began to tell me about certain broken family dynamics, how he was hopefully using sports to go to the league after college and bring his family out of a really bad circumstance, and all these different things that might have contributed to what he did and what got him in trouble. Part of our program was not just discipline, but also discipline and restoration. So what I decided in terms of his program was to mandate counseling for him. He did a series of sessions, and the counseling center came back to me and said he's progressing, but I want to say that the director of the counseling center said that he had severe depression. That was coupled with the student also talking about suicidal ideation. He had actually texted his football team player roommate about suicide, and his roommate texted him back, I'm out with my girlfriend right now. I'll talk to you when I get back. So it ended up progressing, and before we finalized the disciplinary process, he had to unenroll from school because the depression got so bad. So he left mid-semester. So I would say that, coupled with one of my closest friends having some mental health struggles, it kind of put my attention on Black men as a whole and maybe some paradigms that we have about masculinity that keep us from getting the help we need, specifically as it relates to mental and emotional health. So putting all this together made me realize, okay, we need to address this. Like, there's not enough safe spaces for men. So I just started writing a book. While I was there in Oklahoma, started writing a book, which came to be a book called Whole Brother, Debunking the Myths That Break the Black Family. And it dealt with father-son dynamics in Black families, how certain types of fathers have certain traits come up in those sons, and how misguided notions, myths that we have about masculinity are what keep this cycle going.
Wow.
there were a lot of critiques in the book. And I realized one day, hey, if I'm going to put out something to the public, I do have an understanding of politics as well. And I do know politically there's a lot of people that point the finger at Black men and Black fathers as a whole. And I didn't want to encourage that because some of that I think is unjust. So I said, if I put this book out, I have to also have a resource to offer as a solution to the issues I'm raising in this book about Black culture and Black families. So the book came first, and the nonprofit, the organization, came later as a result of what was raised in the book. So then we have the Whole Brother Mission, which is
Okay, hold on. Because it may be normal and natural to you, but me sitting here listening going, to go from you being this assistant dean to having to work with the student and seeing that the student has, some real challenges with depression, as well as a friend of yours, to then say, I need to do something about that. I'm gonna write a book, and then I'm gonna create an organization. Where did that come from? Because that's not how a lot of people would have responded to the.
Yeah. So let me be clear. So that student situation was the last straw for me. I already had years of navigating through stuff like that with my closest friend.
Got it.
Who was kind of up and down, and then eventually went to the Navy. So I had already been observing that, and for years trying to figure out what is going on here. And I end up actually talking to the director of the counseling center about my friend as well. As I was talking to her about that student, she was like, "Yeah, that sounds kind of like this." So she was putting words and diagnoses to things that I didn't know at the time. So I realized, there's categories for that. There's a label for that. Yeah. But again, the culture that I come from, and particularly my friend that I was speaking of, it was like, he's okay. We don't want to go talk to a doctor, especially I think there's that added element of being a Christian and how we think we don't need to talk to those secular psychologists because God's got us. So my friend never got the help he needed and then went to the military, and I think made it worse. There are other relationships I had along the way where I knew guys were dealing with depression, but we didn't know to call it depression. Like in college, one of my floor mates, there was a certain point where he just stopped grooming himself. Like at one point he was called a pretty boy, and then that stopped. And he stopped grooming himself, and he gained like 30, 40 pounds, didn't want to leave the room. And everyone notices that something's happening, but no one had words for it. And looking back, it's like, no, that was a deep depression that he was in, and it was tied to his parents' divorce.
Wow.
So it's like you're observing all these different things happening with men in particular, and there is no happy ending. Right. I see images of women divorces. All her female friends gather around her, girl, we're going to get you through this. And when I look at my life and experiences with other men, it just didn't happen. It was just kind of a sad ending. So I saw that a lot. And then that student was just the last straw.
Got it.
And that's why I was like, okay, this needs to be addressed specifically for Black men because I don't see a voice that's addressing this.
And one of the things you talk about in the book and just a lot in general is misguided senses of masculinity. There's a lot of conversations right now happening about toxic masculinity and things like that. What have you noticed and observed about masculinity, how it's understood, and especially in the African-American male context that prompted you to speak to that?
Yeah, there's so much. One in particular I would say is, even with that friend I was telling you about, after he joined the military, he stopped communicating as much. And I remember talking to his dad about it because his dad would check in with me, like, have you heard from him? And I'm like, no, I haven't heard from him. So there were two conversations in particular that his dad and I had while he's abroad somewhere. And his dad came to me, he said, I got 2 sons and 2 daughters. The 2 daughters are the younger ones. And he said, I feel like he doesn't talk to me as much because I didn't learn gentleness until my daughters came. I was probably too hard on him. And that's probably, so I'm talking to my friend's dad about why he doesn't talk to him. And I'm like, well, he'll talk to me either. But there's a lot of factors that go into that. But that is a huge part of it, is that his understanding of raising his sons was challenging. Everything needs to be a challenge to make you better. And I do think it probably didn't have the balance of gentleness, so it ended up pushing them away.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that we can't, have that edge
Right.
that I think we appreciate in men challenging other men to be better. But we do, I think, underserve as it relates to that other aspect. We tend to think, I was actually just talking about this in another interview. There was a content creator that pretty much said that we need to stop treating men's depression the way we treat women's depression. Women need love and affection. Men don't need love and affection. We just need respect. And I was like, no, that's the problem, that we dehumanize ourselves by thinking, well, I just need respect. Well, no, there's a lot of layers to the human experience, and we lack those things. So I think one of the things is this truncated view of what men need in interpersonal relationships, but also in this example of my friend and his dad in terms of parenting. Many of us were raised by men that had little to no emotional vocabulary. So that then hinders us as we come up. And then if you start a family, you might pass that same stuff on. So the cycle continues. So I do think there is this generational aspect of fathers that maybe were emotionally disconnected because they didn't know any better. They didn't see anything better. And there's a limited view of parenting, fathering, that just includes protecting and providing, nothing more. But men, women, humans, children need more than just food and shelter in terms of development. But because we've lacked those things, I think we as men end up being disabled in many ways.
Wow. So in other words, I'm hearing you say that the disproportionate emphasis only on things like respect or challenge, and the de-emphasis on things like vulnerability, on love, that itself creates situations where when men struggle, they don't even know where to go or how to work through the things that they're experiencing.
Right. And then and a more real to life example is getting into a relationship, maybe getting married, and then not knowing how to go to that emotionally vulnerable place with your wife if you've never even gone there on your own.
Right.
And an unintended consequence is it puts a lot of pressure when a guy that's been disconnected from his emotions that long gets married. It makes the job of the wife that much harder because she's not just lover and friend, but she also in some ways ends up having to play therapist too because he hasn't even touched those categories that do exist, but we lull ourselves to sleep by saying that we don't have emotions.
Gotcha. And I know you have quite a lot of, I think, takes and perspectives on dating, singleness, and relationships. So let's go there for a second because you're single, and yet you've obviously through your own encounters, relationships with people who are married, have kind of developed takes and perspective on, such as, wow, it creates a high burden for a spouse when somebody hasn't worked through their stuff. When you think about dating and dating culture today, how does that impact this whole idea of a whole man?
So, where you're from, right? So let me just say personally, I think as a result of processing through a lot of this stuff, going to counseling personally, but also studying it and talking to people, there was a point, I had to scale it back, but there was a point where I had about 30 clients a week. A lot of times in a Christian church setting, if there's a new ministry starting, the assumption is we need a Christian couple to lead this. Or there's this thing where it's like when a man gets married, he reaches his spiritual pinnacle. As if the single men are just out here lollygagging. So I do think, having done some personal work, I've still run into this thing where I do think we assume spiritual maturity is coupled with marriage. And that's not always the case. I do think someone spiritually maturing may remain single for that exact reason, that they're spiritually mature and they're not going to pick a partner based on convenience. So I would say a misconception is that marriage is a part of the 10 steps of spiritual success, and it's step 10, not necessarily.
Yeah. No, that's good. So you decided to title your book and then later the organization Whole Brother.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because when we started to connect about the Whole Man project and book, noticed that we kind of had some of the same categories: head, heart, hands.
Mm-hmm.
What was significant? What was important for you to identify this aspect of whole, and how does that relate to those categories?
Right. So I do think when we have conversations about personal growth, a lot of men turn their receivers off because it may seem as if though you have to be perfect. Even in Christian settings, it may feel like there's perfection or there's those really, really spiritual elites, and then there's the rest of us. So whole, it was meant to be articulated as an alternative. It's to acknowledge that we're not necessarily trying to strive for men to be perfect, but it is a point of optimum health for relating well to others. So there's perfection, there's going in the complete opposite direction of perfection, going in a terrible direction, but then there's this middle ground, which we would say is wholeness. Wholeness is having the posture to pivot where necessary. The awareness that I may need to change certain aspects of myself. And then also the fortitude and ability to pour into the lives of others. I do think when we start leaning in this other direction, part of the issue relationally is you can't expect someone to pour into your cup if they don't even have anything in theirs. That's leaning in this direction. So it's like enough in my cup to have some in my cup and to pour to you is what I would say wholeness is. But I don't got to be full either.
That's good. You know what that reminds me of? The Apostle Paul in Colossians, the Apostle Paul in Colossians 1:28 says, "Him," meaning Christ, "we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ." Some versions say perfect in Christ. And the idea there is complete in Christ. There's a sense of completion. So it's interesting that he sees a relationship between maturity and wholeness. And maturity doesn't mean like 100% you got it all figured out, but that in their version of perfect just meant like almost like a ripe fruit. You know, it's perfect in the sense that it's perfectly mature. Is that kind of what you're seeing in terms of the relationship between wholeness and maturity?
Yeah. Because I do think there's a point where someone may not be whole. And again, wholeness isn't perfection, but there is a point where I would say that lacking certain things may mean that you should not be in a romantic relationship. I know for many of us as men, we assume that we're ready as soon as we see someone we're attracted to. Must be ready, right? But there are certain things you do need to bring to the table for this to be a healthy situation. So I would say wholeness is having that posture to be able to relate to others well and not be a damaging force in their lives. But there are certain factors that may be at play in someone's life that may make them a dangerous person, especially in that context. So they may need to refrain for that period of time.
So you go down this road after seeing these men in your life struggle. You write the book, and then you build out Whole Brother, the book, and then you said something. You build out an organization after that. What? Tell us a little bit about that organization.
Yeah. So the Whole Brother Mission is a 501c3 launched in 2019, and we have a nationwide network of therapists offering mental health services to Black men and their families nationwide, all 50 states and D.C. And on some occasions, through fundraising, we're able to cover the fees for therapy for certain men that are unemployed and uninsured.
And that's an amazing pivot and resource that you've now created. And so when we think about the Whole Man, devotional book, the video resource, what excites you and where do you see the connection between that and what you've been involved in?
Yeah. So I think I can say this in this interview. There's this unique thing where while I'm pro-counseling, as a Christian, I also recognize that our greatest need is for salvation. And that doesn't rival therapy in any way, but there is a point where you can talk to someone, you can deal with all the cognitive distortions, you can help them work past their trauma. But if they don't know Jesus, I recognize that that's still a barrier. And in many cases, you sit in a session and you recognize someone's longing for something and they can't put words to it. So in some situations, I would say, or in many, ultimately, it goes back to salvation. I would say not that is necessarily going to fix every issue on this side, but it's more so an answer of eternity. But also, I would say that when someone receives salvation and, similar to how I did, began to find identity in that rather than seeking it from people, I do think it does bring a new level of peace that some people don't realize that they will get on the other side. So when we think about this whole man devotional, I think it weds those two very well. It's able to go further in a way that I wasn't able to with the whole brother book, which was meant to be marketed more broadly. We can narrow down more specifically and say that your mental and emotional health matter, but we have this soul element as well and spirit, because salvation is a huge piece.
Man, well, it's been really exciting to go on this journey with you, right? And to lean into your expertise, to meet cool people who are doing amazing work in this, like Dr. Nee Addy, who is a neuroscientist,
Yes.
And others. But you didn't stop with Whole Brother Mission. Like, you continued to pursue higher education, and tell us a little bit about where that has landed you.
Yeah. So we're here finishing out school, and my doctorate is looking at the most common reasons, or my dissertation is looking at the most common reasons that Black men are in counseling. Some of the most commonly reported diagnoses are depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder. As far as what individuals report, it commonly is tied to some type of discontentment with life, loss, and you probably know this one, romantic relationships.
Loss, romantic relationships, and discontentment with life. Gotcha. And how is that helpful, knowing that?
I mean, I think it's helpful, again, because I think many of us as men are very much so behind in terms of being able to put words to our experience. I do think it's helpful to hear out loud, hey, you're discontent with life, and that's okay.
Right.
Many of us wouldn't even articulate it that way.
Right.
You might say, I'm good, even though you're discontent with life, or just say it's a lot going on. Well, that's not really helping anybody. So I think just the language as a whole helps kind of open up this dialogue about, okay, you're feeling something. We can call a thing, and after we call a thing, then we can help deal with that.
Right. All right. What have been moments in the culture, in the faith community, that have given you hope, that have caused you to see, like, this is work helping us move toward wholeness?
That's a good question. I would say, from a secular perspective, there is a more openness to mental health, I think, in the Black community. That's growing, and the church is a part of that. I think the church is progressing in that direction. So I want to applaud that things are moving, and we're talking about things that we might not have even talked about before. For that to continue, though, I would say I think it's necessary for us to wrestle through this idea of God still being sovereign and omnipotent, and that not also meaning that we cannot seek these other recourses for support. So to continue this momentum that we have, I do think we have to kind of wrestle through that, because in my work with the Whole Brother Mission, the people that have been the most resistant have been Christians. And I think that's due to somehow we believe that talking to a therapist is an indictment on God's abilities or a lack of faith in him. When in actuality, there are Christian therapists and psychologists. We just, work with Dr. Nee Addy a Christian neuroscientist and professor of psychiatry. So, you know, I do think we've hit a wall. There is a wall that's there where people are like, well, I don't know where I need to be on this. And even in my doctoral work, we talked about the resistance. My recommendation, or what I would add to the conversation, would be that you can have Jesus and a therapist the same way that you have Jesus and a primary care physician.
So have there been particular passages in scripture that you help people, you point people to kind of affirm or support the synergy between therapy and Jesus?
Yeah. So sometimes the resistance is that it's that secular psychology that's going to mess with your mind and so on and so forth. When in actuality, there are a lot of things in that, quote, secular psychology or social work or counseling or marriage and family therapy that do overlap with things that Scripture is telling us to do. So, for example, a therapist, whether Christian or not, may talk to their client about their thought life. What are the things that you're ruminating on, thinking on, reminiscing on? And could that be hindering or improving your experience? A therapist or psychologist may help someone deal with cognitive distortions, things that they have accepted as true or created in their mind that don't necessarily correspond to reality, but they're living as if they're true. I would say, we've spoke earlier about Philippians 4, where the Scripture is telling us to meditate on these things that are praiseworthy and of a good report. So you have the same recommendation there coming from two different sources. And I would say if you're wrestling with Jesus in therapy, that's one example of how some of the conclusions that secular disciplines arrive at are only pointing us back to what Scripture has already told us.
Can I add one to that? Proverbs 20, verse 5. The purpose in a man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out.
Yeah.
This idea that sometimes it says a purpose of a man's heart is like deep water. It's a picture of a well, and that you can't just go and get the water. Sometimes that there's somebody else that needs to, if I'm the deep water, I'm deep in the well, I need somebody else to draw me out. And I think that that's a picture. And of course, another one is in Ecclesiastes when it says, unless, two walk together, if one falls in the ditch and by himself, he's just stuck in the ditch. But if somebody else walks alongside of him and pulls him out, then he can find relief. A 3-strand cord is not easily broken. And in that 3-strand, and I think that's probably a great way for us to kind of end, because the threads in that is there's the person in need of the counseling, there's the counseling, and then there's the Holy Spirit that's weaving it all together. There's been 3 of us that have been on this whole man journey together. And one of them is your own brother.
Yes.
Jerome, tell us about, so we talked about the whole. You could have chose a lot of words for your book, but you chose brother, which seems to imply a relational dynamic, right? When you think of a brother, what's the significance of the brother part, and even tie that into your own experience of being a brother?
So in the context of the Whole Brother mission and the Whole Brother book, it was more so to make a distinction. Think of it as brother, BROTHA, Black man. So it was more so meant in that context.
Right.
But also, I will say, and you read the book, so there's this idea of community amongst men too.
Yes.
So having brothers is important. Yeah. So it's Black men focused, but also community of men focused.
Have you seen that as being an important part of the mental health challenge, is the lack of community?
Oh gosh. I cannot tell you how many college guys have come through thinking that the issue is their lack of romantic relationships, and we end up landing on your alternative is women due to your lack of depth and relationship in your community. And you're coming in thinking I need more women in my life, when in reality, I need more substantive relationships for me to feel whole. So I do think it's a lot bigger than we think.
Yeah.
And maybe it's the American dream, and maybe it's the scripture about leaving father and mother and clinging to wife. That I do think we overemphasize that while discounting all these other relationships that are really important for someone's life.
Well, I'm so grateful that you have helped bring attention to the importance of community, the importance of mental health, and now the importance of being a whole man.
That's it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.